In this video, you'll get an overview of the complete After Effects workflow, as well as an introduction to the basic terminology used throughout After Effects. After you've watched this video, you'll have a better idea of what specific videos to watch in this video training course to satisfy your specific needs. You won't need to perform the steps in this video yourself, but if you want to follow along, you can open the Introducing project in the Assets folder. No matter what kind of work you're doing in After Effects, the basic steps are often the same. You usually import assets, such as movies and still image items. You use those assets as sources for layers, which you assemble in a composition. You modify the properties of the layers, including animating some of the properties. You add effects to layers and often modify and animate their properties. You preview your composition, and then you render and export the composition to an output movie. Let's look at each of these steps in a bit more detail. Whenever After Effects is running, a project is open. You can see which project is open by looking at the top of the application window. Here we see Introducing.aep, which is the name of the project that we have open. Introducing.aep is the file name extension for projects. You'll almost always import items into a project. We refer to these items that are imported as source files. Within a project, source files are used as the basis for footage items. Here in the project panel, we have some folders into which the footage items have been placed to keep them organized. If I click this triangle, we can see all of the footage items that I've placed in the Movies folder. I'll drag this column heading so that you can see a little bit more of the titles. These are the names of the footage items. Usually they're based on the source file name, although you can rename these yourself. You can open a footage item in its own footage panel by double-clicking it in the project panel. In the footage panel, you can preview a footage item, and you can trim it. Trimming refers to selecting only a portion of the footage item to use in the composition. The composition is the basic framework for a movie. Here is a composition in the project panel. If I double-click a composition in the project panel, it opens in both the composition panel and the timeline panel. The timeline panel and composition panel give two complementary ways of looking at a composition. In the timeline panel, you can see each individual layer in a composition, and you can interact with its properties individually. The composition panel, on the other hand, shows the visual composite of all of these layers. A composite is, roughly speaking, the visual result from stacking layers on top of one another. One of the primary things that you do in After Effects is to stack layers on top of one another and then determine how one layer shows through another. This is referred to as compositing. Here in the timeline panel, you can see that we have one layer called Logo Precomposition. And from the icon, you can see that this is itself a composition. You can have compositions nested one inside of the other, with the nested composition, or the precomposition, serving as the source for a layer in much the same way that any other footage item does. If we double-click this precomposition layer, it opens in its own composition panel. Here, we can see that this composition consists of just the logo. We can go back to view the containing layer by clicking its tab in the timeline panel. Each layer has several properties. You can view the properties of a layer by clicking the triangle next to its name in the timeline panel. The name of the property group that all layers have is Transform. If we click its triangle and give ourselves a little bit more room in the timeline panel, we can see the names of the basic transformations. One way that you can interact with properties to change their values is to change the numbers here in the timeline panel. For example, to change the position of our vector graphic logo, we can click this number and then type a new one, and then hit enter, and notice the position of our logo changed. To undo a change, you can press Ctrl-Z or Command-Z on macOS, and it undoes the change. You can also change properties by dragging, or for any of the properties, including these transformation properties, you can interact with the layer directly in the composition panel. Notice I can change the position property by dragging the logo directly in the composition panel. I'll press Ctrl-Z to undo. If you modify a property so that it has a different value at one time than it has at another time, that's referred to as animation. Any property that has one of these little stopwatch icons next to it can be animated. The most common way to animate properties in After Effects is to use keyframes. A keyframe specifies that a property has a certain value at a certain time. And then, usually, you have a keyframe at another time that specifies a different value. After Effects will interpolate, or make up the information in between the two keyframes,